black janitor was invited to spar with the black belt for amusement. The whole martial arts studio fell silent as someone asked, "What happened next?" Derek Mitchell yelled from the middle of the mat, his black belt shining under the fluorescent lights of the gym. "Hey, you there cleaning? How about a quick demonstration?" James Washington paused his cleaning and gently raised his head, saying, "I bet you've never seen a real fight in your life, right?" He was 42 years old and had just been a janitor at that gym for 3 weeks. He consistently showed up after hours, after the students had departed. However, the training for the advanced sessions had gone past the regular time on that Thursday evening. "I don't want to bother you, Sensei," James said coolly before getting back to cleaning a tough stain off the floor. "Simply, I'm going to finish up here so you can get back to it," Derek said, his dramatic laugh resonating across the room. Derek didn't realize that James had been trying to forget who he really was for the past 20 years since he left the ring after an accident that changed his life forever, and 20 years of keeping a secret that not even his teenage daughter knew about. "Come on, man," Derek continued, approaching him with that haughty smile he used to intimidate beginners. "Look at this, everyone. The guys are scared to even step on the mat." The 8 students there laughed nervously, some obviously uncomfortable with the situation between someone who trains and someone who just cleans. James felt that familiar sensation in his chest, like a muscle that had been dormant for years, and for a split second, something passed between his eyes and Derek's that caused the instructor to take an involuntary step back. Derek insisted that it was just an educational demonstration, now trying to hide the sudden uncertainty in his voice. "Nothing too serious. Just to show the beginners why it's important to respect the martial art." James set the bucket on the floor and stood up slowly, his movements having a strange fluidity for someone who had supposedly never stepped on a tatami mat before. "All right," James said at last, his voice calm as the surface of a lake before a storm. "But when we're done, you're going to apologize to all of them for turning the mat into a circus." Derek laughed, but it sounded a little forced this time. "You're going to be the one saying, 'I'm sorry' to the floor when you meet it." What none of those people knew was that James Washington was actually James Silent Storm Washington, a 5-time world mixed martial arts champion who had retired at the height of his career after an accident that killed his best friend and training partner, and that he had vowed never to fight again. However, some promises are made to be broken when dignity is at stake. If you're enjoying this tale of overcoming adversity and justice, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to learn how a simple moment of prejudice would turn into the most embarrassing lesson of Derek Mitchell's life. "Look everyone," Derek said, making dramatic gestures as the 8 students formed a semicircle around the mat, some clearly uncomfortable, some eager for the demonstration, and one young Asian woman with her hair tied back, muttering something to her classmate next to her, who simply shook his head in disapproval. "Pay attention, everyone. You're about to see a practical demonstration of why there is a hierarchy in the world of martial arts," James observed. "Here we have a perfect example of someone who never understood that there are appropriate places for certain types of people. Elite gyms are not for, well, you know." James experienced the same tinge in his chest that he had when he heard similar remarks about fighters who didn't look like champions 20 years prior. The difference was that he had learned to control his wrath by the age of 42, into fuel for punches that are far less effective. With timidity, the young Asian woman interrupted, "Sensei Derek, we could carry on with our regular training. Perhaps it is becoming late." "Sarah Chen, are you doubting my approach to teaching?" Derek interrupted her abruptly. "Watch from a seat. In just 5 minutes, you will learn more than you would in a month of traditional instruction." James observed that Derek clearly showed authority by using the girl's full name. He recognized the terrified expression in her eyes as well. 2 decades ago, when he woke up in a panic, he saw the same expression in the mirror, recalling the accident that killed his best friend and training partner, Tony Hammer Rodriguez. He had caused Tony's death. That's how easy it was. A string of blows that James had delivered with too much vigor when sparring. Tony collapsed, struck his head oddly on the floor, and never came to. Although James was aware of the facts, the investigation determined that it was an accident. Because of the pressure and the racial remarks made by the audience that evening, he had lost control. Thus, Derek, the janitor, scoffed. "Would it be possible to demonstrate a basic guard to my students, or does someone who can just push a mop find that too difficult?" There was laughter throughout the gym, but James did not move. When his eyes closed, he was momentarily transported back to the Las Vegas ring, where he heard the identical remarks that had preceded the tragedy that permanently altered his life. "What is wrong? Are you afraid?" Derek, who was now stalking James, demanded. "Or are you simply going to stand there like you are a lamppost, spend all day with a squeegee?" At that point, Derek committed his first deadly error. With all the haughtiness of someone who had never really been held accountable for his actions, he gave James a gentle shoulder nudge that seemed innocuous at the time. James took the shove without flinching. Derek's feet stayed firmly rooted, like oak roots, and he had the impression that he had attempted to push a concrete wall. For a brief while, the instructor's haughty sneer faltered. "Interesting," James said, more to himself than to Derek. The atmosphere was altered by something in James' voice as he said, "It's been a while since someone tried to provoke me like that." There was no anger or menace. It was the frightful serenity of someone who had experienced even darker valleys and come out of them changed. Derek doubled down, unable to see the warning signs of peril. "Gentlemen, did you hear that? He finds it intriguing. How about we explain to him the distinction between knowing and thinking?" Derek was unaware that James was being roused by every degrading remark and action which had been dormant for 20 years. Not rage or a desire for vengeance, but something much more sinister. His recall of his true self when he came out of hiding was crystal vivid. Uncomfortable, Sarah Chen watched. The sight, the way the janitor inhaled and his muscles, strained almost imperceptibly, made her think of the Discovery Channel videos she had seen about huge animals. The quiet before the assault. "Last chance," Buddy Derek declared sharply, clearly annoyed by James's silence at this point. "You accept the protest like a man, or I'll contact security to take you away. And guess what? You lose your job, too." James opened his eyes gradually, as if he had suddenly roused a dragon he had assumed to be a harmless lizard. The teacher felt a shiver go down his spine when his eyes locked with Dirk's. "All right," James replied at last, his voice low but full of authority that instantly silenced everyone in the room. "But when we're done, I want you to explain to your students why you turned a place of learning into a circus of humiliation." Derek laughed and sounded apprehensive this time. "Dude, you're going to have a lot of explaining to do when you're on the floor." Neither of them realized that James had been avoiding his history for the past 20 years, but also honing an emotional control technique that had changed his former. Derek's 8 students formed a perfect circle around the mat, some eager for the demonstration, others visibly uncomfortable with the situation unfolding before them. Derek announced theatrically, extending his arms like a showman, "Everyone, you are about to witness a lesson worth more than 6 months of training," highlighting the difference between those who dedicate their lives to martial arts and those who simply clean the floor where real fighters walk. Each new humiliation only fueled a silent strength within him, a cold determination that his former opponents knew well, but that Derek was about to discover in the worst possible way. In the middle of the mat, James stood still, but his breathing had changed. His eyes had closed for a moment, and for a second, he was back at the National Gymnasium in Las Vegas 22 years prior to his world title fight against Victor the Demolition Man. "Look at that little black guy," someone in the stands had yelled that faraway night. "I bet he won't last 3 rounds against a real fighter." James had won by technical knockout in the second round, but the victory had cost him dearly, and the pressure of the racist remarks had caused him to lose control during the next sparring session, which led to Tony Rodriguez's unintentional death. "So, janitor," Derek sneered, now circling James like a predator, "how about showing my students how not to do a basic guard? Or is that too for someone who can only push a mop? Is it difficult?" Sarah Chin, a 22-year-old purple belt in jiu-jitsu and a master's student of sports psychology, had spent the previous 2 years documenting instances of discrimination in sports for her thesis, and what she was witnessing was both deeply disturbing and valuable academic material. "Sensei Derek," she interrupted firmly, "can I ask you a question? Why exactly do you think it's necessary to humiliate someone who is just doing his job?" The silence that followed was deafening. Derek turned slowly to Sarah, his eyes narrowing with a mixture of surprise and annoyance. "Excuse me, Sarah, but who's teaching the class here?" "You are, but that shouldn't include racial humiliation disguised as a technical demonstration," she said calmly. The instructor's face flushed with a mixture of anger and embarrassment, because no one had ever confronted Derek like this before. Racial. Derek laughed forcefully. This has nothing to do with race. It has to do with respect for the martial art and knowing your place. James opened his eyes slowly. Something about Sarah's speech, which was delivered with the bravery of a young woman defying authority, reminded him of his younger sister Kesha, who had the same resolve and that same refusal to accept injustice in silence. Kesha had died at the age of 17 after being shot by a stray bullet during a police confrontation in her neighborhood. James was competing in Japan when he got the news. Another excuse to drop everything and fade into the anonymity of an anonymous life. If you can't respect my teaching methods, maybe you should look for another gym, Derek stated, in a dangerously low voice, referring to Sarah. There are other locations that are more suited for folks with your mindset. The danger hovered like poisonous smoke in the air. A shiver went down Sarah's spine, but she refused to back down. I've paid my tuition, Sensei, and I think that everyone here should be able to study in an atmosphere that values respect for one another, rather than humiliation. James then did something that nobody had anticipated. A smile came to his face. The smile wasn't one of apprehension or submission. The smile was slow and deliberate, as if someone had just discovered a cause to come out of hiding. He has lived with the guilt of 2 deaths for 20 years. Came about indirectly as a result of his participation in the combat scene. James Washington started to rediscover who he truly was after witnessing a courageous young woman upholding justice beliefs he had abandoned decades prior. Derek, James remarked at last, his voice exuding a quiet authority that caused everyone in the room to turn to him. Derek spun on his heels, his face flushed with outrage. The young lady is right. This isn't about martial arts. It's about you trying to feel important by belittling others. James took a step forward, and his posture changed fundamentally. His shoulders straightened, his center of gravity lowered imperceptibly, and his feet positioned themselves in a stance that any seasoned fighter would immediately recognize as perfect. Actually, James said calmly, I know. I'll teach you respect the hard way. I'll teach you what a dojo is, and I know that this place ceased to be one a long time ago. Derek felt an inexplicable chill go down his spine. James's current manner of moving and occupying the space awakened all of his instincts for self-preservation, but his wounded pride would not allow him to back down. Enough talk, Derek growled, assuming his favorite fighting stance. Sarah watched the scene with growing apprehension, but also with professional fascination. Something about the janitor's movements reminded her of the great masters she had studied in historical videos. The economy of movement, the controlled breathing, and the calm presence that radiated contained power. James closed his eyes for a moment, allowing 22 years of muscle memory to come back. Derek laughed, but the sound came out nervous and forced. Apologize, man. You'll be begging for forgiveness when you're on the floor. Derek was looking straight into the eyes of 5-time world mixed martial arts champion Silent Storm Washington when he opened them again. James had already identified all of his technical weaknesses, including the high guard's tendency to retreat with his right leg first. And the way he signaled his punches with tiny shoulder movements. Years away from the ring had not erased decades of refined technical analysis, and Sarah saw that other students were instinctively backing away, like wild animals sensing an impending storm. The energy in the room had completely changed, as if the air had become electrically charged before a lightning strike. And it was only when everyone laughed at Derek's latest taunts that something unexpected began to take shape in James's expression, not anger or a desire for vengeance, but the calm determination of someone who had found a cause worth breaking a 20-year vow of silence. Some of those in attendance started to realize that something extraordinary was about to happen, even though they did not fully comprehend what they were seeing. Derek assumed his favorite fighting stance, the one he had used for years to intimidate hundreds of beginners. Feet shouldered width apart, fists clenched at chest level, weight slightly forward. The classic stance of someone who had learned for a few seconds. James stood still, just watching, his eyes scanning Derek from head to toe, automatically cataloging every technical detail, the high guard that exposed his ribs, the unsteady base that made it difficult for him to balance, and the excessive tension in his shoulders that signaled every move before it even started. Still waiting, Derek sneered, hopping slightly on his feet. Or are you just going to stand there like a lamppost? At that point, James did something nobody saw coming. He began to move. It wasn't a big change, just a slight shift in his feet, a slight lowering of his center of gravity, and his shoulders relaxing into a perfectly horizontal line. Look for it. The change was instantaneous and terrifying. Sarah Chin, who had spent 2 years studying sports biomechanics and had watched hundreds of hours of footage of great fighters, had just seen the transformation from a regular man to a born redditor. It was a subtle but devastating change. Interesting, Derek muttered, his confidence faltering for the first time. Something about the way James occupied the space now awakened all of his self-preservation instincts. James took a step forward, and Derek instinctively backed away. The movement was so involuntary, so primitive, that multiple students noticed. A black belt backing away from a janitor. The power dynamic in the room had completely changed. Even though every fiber of his being was screaming at him to stop and apologize, Derek couldn't back down now. "No problem," Derek said, forcing a smile. "Just admiring your posture." James asked softly, his voice carrying a quiet authority that silenced everyone. Derek felt the blood rush to his cheeks. "Did someone use YouTube to teach you that?" James responded calmly. "I learned it at a place called the Las Vegas National Gym. Maybe you've heard of it." Derek scowled. The name sounded familiar, but he couldn't identify the reference. The joke went flat. No one laughed. The tension in the room had almost reached a physical level. "What kind of weekend boot camp did you do there?" Sarah Chen discreetly pulled her phone out of her pocket and quickly typed, "Las Vegas National Gym Martial Arts." What she found made her blood run cold. This wasn't just any prep course. It was where the world's greatest MMA champions of the last 3 decades had trained. "Derek," James continued, his voice still calm, "last chance. Apologize to Sarah for questioning her right to speak. Apologize to your students for turning this place into a circus. And most of all, apologize to yourself for becoming exactly the kind of person that martial arts should teach you not to be." The offer of clemency hung in the air like smoke. Derek could have chosen humility. He could have acknowledged that he had crossed the line. Instead, he attacked. Derek's first punch was technically flawless, a quick, accurate jab that was performed exactly as he had learned in the manuals. It was the type of punch that worked against 99% of the people he had sparred with over the years. But James wasn't in the 99%. The movement was so quick and fluid that half of those in attendance couldn't even comprehend what had happened. James was just not where Derek's fist had been aimed. His body had slid to the side like water around a rock, and then all of a sudden, Derek was unbalanced, his arm out into thin air. "Nice try," James said quietly, "already repositioned and perfectly balanced. Clean technique, adequate speed, but you telegraphed the move with your right shoulder." The second attack came in quick succession. Jab, straight, hook. Derek spun wildly, trying to find his opponent. How had someone moved so fast? "Beginner's luck," he muttered, more to himself than to James. This was his favorite sequence, the one he used to finish sparring sessions and impress beginners. James was not there again, but Sarah was able to follow the movement. James had lowered himself slightly, allowing the jab to pass over his head by inches. The straight punch found only air when he leaned back in an impossible curve. And when Derek threw the hook with all his strength, James took a small step back, causing the fist to pass millimeters from his chin. "Interesting combination," James noted. "Stay breathing evenly. Works well against people who stand still, but you're leaving your left side completely exposed." Derek began to perspire after the hook, which wasn't typical. He had thrown thousands of punches in his life, and now he couldn't throw one on a man who purportedly had never fought before. "Stop dancing and fight." Derek's yell set off an even more violent sequence, and James decided the protest had lasted long enough. Derek's third attack, a desperate barrage of punches and kicks, found nothing but air once more. But this time, something was different. And James was strangely closer when Derek recovered after missing all of his blows. "How?" Realizing that he had fully lost control of the distance, Derek muttered. "Derek," James said softly, now an arm's length away. "Do you want to know what makes someone who learned to fight in gyms different from someone who learned in professional rings?" James did something before Derek could respond that went against everything everyone in the room believed they knew about physics. Without seeming to use any force or make any abrupt or violent movements, he simply touched Derek on the chest. with the palm of his right hand, and Derek flew not pushed or knocked down, but literally thrown backwards, as if hit by an invisible wave, his feet leaving the ground. And he traveled nearly 2 meters through the air before landing on his back with an impact that left everyone in the room gasping. The silence that followed was Derek lay on the floor for a few seconds, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what had happened. There was no pain, just the irresistible force of someone operating on a level completely different from anything he had ever known. "That," Derek muttered, trying to get up. "That's impossible." Sarah Chen had stopped breathing. In 2 years of studying martial arts, she had never witnessed such a controlled and devastating display of power. There was no brutality, no anger, just the clinical application of a technique she had only seen in legends. "Really," James said calmly, reaching out to assist Derek to his feet. "It's quite simple once you understand leverage, timing, and energy transfer. Principles I've learned over a 22-year professional career." Outstretched hand and got to his feet on his own, his legs still shaking. 22 years of professional career, in what? Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. "You don't know who he is, do you?" Everyone turned to her, who was still holding her cell phone with the results of her search, and the screen displayed dozens of articles, pictures, and videos that validated what she already knew. James Washington, also known as Silent Storm, was a 5-time world mixed martial arts champion, regarded as one of the greatest technical fighters in history, who retired undefeated after a 22-year career after following an accident that resulted in the death of his training partner. Derek felt the words hit the room like a bomb, and his face became pale as reality set in. He had publicly insulted someone who could have easily knocked him out with a casual move, and he had challenged a live martial arts icon. "No," Derek muttered. "If I had known, if you had known, would you have treated me with respect?" James interrupted gently. "But would you still have humiliated some other janitor?" James nodded silently. "5-time world champion," Derek stammered, all his arrogance vanishing instantly. "Since then, I've been working whatever jobs I can find. Cleaning, maintenance, simple jobs, simple life. No spotlight, no cameras, no need to prove anything to anyone. Sensei Derek, for 2 years, I have trained at this academy out of respect for your experience, but what I witnessed today was not teaching, but bullying disguised as instruction." Other students started to murmur in agreement. The revelation about James had completely changed everyone's perspective on what they had witnessed. "James," Derek finally said, his voice laden with a humility no one there had ever heard before. The question struck deeper than any physical blow. Derek realized that James had pinpointed the root of his true issue, not ignorance about his credentials, but the fundamental arrogance that led him to believe he could humiliate people based on their professions. "I am truly sorry, Sarah, to you, to everyone present. I have no justification for my actions. I'll change," Derek promised. "It'll take time, but I'll change." James nodded, accepting the apology with the same grace that he had mastered the physical confrontation. "Thank you, Derek, but apologies are only the first step. The question is, what are you going to do differently from now on?" Derek looked around the room, seeing his students with fresh eyes. Some appeared disappointed in his behavior, while others were obviously re-evaluating everything they thought they knew about hierarchy and respect. Sarah then asked a question that caught everyone off guard. "Mr. Washington, would you consider teaching again?" Because I think one question lingered as Derek fully absorbed the most humiliating lesson of his life. Would one night of humility be enough to transform decades of arrogance? Or would an even deeper change be necessary for true justice to be served? 3 months later, the gym was completely transformed, and Sarah Chen had persuaded the gym owner to hire James Washington as an instructor specializing in advanced techniques and martial arts philosophy. James smiled, the first genuine smile anyone had seen from him that night. After a class on respect and humility, Sarah said, "Sensei James, thank you for teaching me that true strength doesn't need to be displayed to be recognized." The video, which she had secretly recorded, went viral on social media, revealing a black belt being humiliated by a mere janitor, ruining his reputation in the martial arts community. As he arranged the tools, James grinned and said, "The easiest lesson I can impart is straightforward. You should never evaluate someone based on their appearance or occupation. Everybody has a surprising story to tell." At a smaller gym, Derek kept teaching, but now he was more modest due to social embarrassment. The cost of arrogance was something he had discovered the hard way. There are moments when justice arrives subtly, like a storm that silently changes everything. James demonstrated that getting even doesn't mean crushing your opponent, but demonstrating that character, not titles, is the source of greatness. If this tale resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel to see more tales of remarkable individuals overcoming adversity.